I met Hike, I think it was 92 or 93, on Gili Nungu, some islands it's about 40 kilometers from deserts. And he was with Nelson, a kneeboarder, and I was with Crawford, Jeff Crawford. And we kind of went over there in the afternoon, and the next morning got up. They had a speedboat. Probably takes it pretty long trip, probably about an hour to get to the point. And we got there, and you could tell it was big waves coming right as the boat comes around the point, just like that. And I remember I was going, wow, look at this, just barreling, no one out. And we pulled up and we got into the zone where the guy in the boat could motor around and look at the waves that were starting to break. And then we just saw this big set come in and break, probably like 8 foot. And I just immediately was gearing up and jumping off the boat. And I remember it was kind of funny because Bill told me the story later, because he said to Crawford, because he didn't really know me, and he says, "Can Blinky still surf?" And Crawford, with his the way Crawford is, trying to always be Mr. Mystery, he said something like, "We'll see." You know? And then I just paddled over there, and there was nobody out, and got a couple waves, and pretty soon those guys were jumping off the boat too. That's literally the first day I'd been surfing with Bill. I jumped off the boat not knowing, and when you look at a wave from the channel, even though there's no channel, but from where a boat would be looking, as opposed to looking straight on, it's a lot different. You don't really see what the wave's doing. So I caught a wave and faded, thinking, and then just was starting to turn, and I just looked down the line. The thing was probably like 100-yard section, just getting ready to start barreling. I was just like, holy shit. And just turned, got a super good barrel, actually made it, and came out. And that's when I saw those guys starting to jump off the boat, and I looked towards the beach. And before, there's nobody on the beach, and all of a sudden I saw all these feral guys moving around and coming out with boards out of the bushes. And I was like, what the hell is this? And there was all the guys, there's probably like 4 or 5 guys set up already there. And that was their cue to, I guess, paddle out. So even though the tide was technically still a little bit too high. The best conditions for deserts are always low tide, and always in the afternoon, after 3, because that's when the wind, if it switches, is really a good trade wind offshore. Sometimes in the morning it's kind of offshore, but it's wonky and the tide's not right. Now I guess they surf at any tide, any wind, but back then you just wait for the afternoon. And all of a sudden, about 2 o'clock, I guess the land heats up to a certain point, and all of a sudden, what was a slight onshore wind, like every day, just starts going kick, 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 and it just starts flicking around, and within about 15 minutes, it's perfect offshore, and that's the time to paddle out. And you don't want it that big. You want it like, a couple feet overhead at the biggest. It's really better when it's smaller. Well, there's a lot of days when the surf's shitty, and you're out there, and you take all your food. We would take everything we could take, but eventually you like to get some fresh fish. So we always took poles and stuff, and there was one guy named John Hinks that was an actual professional fisherman, super good barrel rider, backside, pig dogger, but he also was a fisherman, and he would always go and always come back with big trevally, like, I don't know how heavy, but big. And I used to go fishing with him. Well, my reputation was the guy that would try the hardest and never get a fish, and put in the most hours, and be out there risking life and limb trying to get a trevally. Because the way we'd get them is we'd go out to the point where the lighthouse was, and wade out onto rocks, climb up on these rocks that might be 4 or 5 feet out of the water, and stand there and try to cast literally into the waves. And you see the trevally swimming by in the face of the wave. And John Hinks, we call him Jono, used to always score some big fish and risk his life. I'd watch him, I'd see like 6, 8 foot waves almost breaking on him, and he's still casting. I'm just like, I don't want to fish that bad. I don't know. I heard it was Bill. And those guys used to have a boat that they'd go over. They'd go to G-land during the tides for G-land, which are the opposite of deserts. And then when the tides were bad at G-land, like as you know, they'd go over to deserts where you want low tide in the afternoon. So I guess they just went back and forth from G-land to deserts, and that's what I heard. He probably knows the exact person, but he's kind of got credit in all of our eyes. Those guys that were there, those original, the one guy you're going to meet, Chris, and Pablo, and a Kiwi guy named Nick, just lived really feral, just little crusty huts, living in the dirt. I mean, and then after I surfed it and realized I'm hooked, I'm coming back the next season, and I went in there and I lived for 2 months, kind of like them, but not quite as bad. I took a couple things, and then came back again the next year, and I brought like a tent, a cooler, and kind of just made living a little more comfortable. I'd have a guy named Wyan build I'd say, look, I want you to start building my hut in April, because all the huts back then would apparently blow down when the off season was and the onshore winds would come. So I'd kind of put in order for a hut that was big enough that he could put sand in the hut into the shade, and then I'd pitch my tent inside the hut. So I had like a roof over my tent so it wouldn't get so hot in the day. But eventually it got, we had like a little kitchen set up. I brought propane, a stove. I used to bring a cooler full of ice. It probably weighed, one of those big white coolers like fishermen use with the rope handles. It probably must have weighed 150 pounds with ice in it.
The Boyum used to hoard those all the time.
Yeah, and those guys, and I'd get the endos, we'd pull up, because back then you couldn't pull right up. You had to come around the point, this other point. You'd have to time it with low tide to get around that point. And you're still wading in a little water. If there's any swell or high tide, you can't make it. You're just stuck there. But I used to pay the guys to carry all my stuff. It looked like a Tarzan movie with just guys carrying stuff, and people would say, "Who's all that shit?" And they all go, "It's all Blinkies." and I'd have the guys with the cooler with 2 big, like a bamboo pole through the rope handles, carrying it and just shaking from the weight, going over the slippery reefs. And I just tell them, "Hey, no matter what, you go down on your knee, whatever. Don't let that cooler touch the rocks." And I'd pay them like $5 each, and they were super happy. One story that's kind of funny is we used to drive from Mataram, which is by Lumbar, like it's probably a 3-hour drive, and park on the other side of that point. You have to wait around. And sometimes after we'd surf, we'd go all the way back to drive to the car at dark to drive back to Mataram. so we could eat good food. And one time, that guy Nick Smart, the Kiwi guy that was super feral, he wanted a ride to Mataram. So it was Nick, me, Bill, and a guy and his girlfriend from LA. His name was Tony. And we got the rent-a-car, started around the point, got onto the paved road, which was still just horrible, full of potholes. And then all of a sudden I was driving and I just felt we had a flat tire. So we pull over in the middle of nowhere. The mosquitoes were a little bit worse in there because it's more in the jungle or bushes more than out on the point. And so we go back to, there's no cars absolutely aren't going to pass you the whole night, guaranteed. It's the end of the road, nobody's out there. So we get the spare tire out and we get the jack and we go to start jacking the car up. Well, the jack's broken. So there's no jacking the car. So we're sitting there and the couple started to panic. I go, we might be here for the night in the car. Because what can you do? You got to stay in there because of the mosquitoes. So we started kind of looking around, thinking of what to do. And Bill and me, we started walking kind of down the road towards Mataram, which was way out of the question to walk. So we're sitting there. All of a sudden, a guy in a bicycle rides up, which was surprising that anyone even came by. So the guy in the bicycle rides up, and in my best Indo, I just said, "Hey, flat tire right over there. I had looked in the book before I started walking, the word for jack, which was Don Karak. I go, we need a Don Karak, blah, blah, blah. And the guy goes, oh, I go, how far to Lumbar or the Palangan, the nearest town? He goes, oh, Jau, far. And I'm like, how much far? That's basically what he's saying. Far. Barapa Jau. And the guy goes, I go, okay, I'll give you, I forget what it was, like 20,000 rupees. It was like $15 or something, which was a deal. So the guy turns around and starts heading back where he was just coming from. So we're thinking, all right, the guy's gonna go get a jack. So we kept walking, and then we saw a rock, pretty good sized rock on the side of the road, and Bill had this idea. He goes, yeah, he picks up this rock, and I go, what are you doing? He's like, come on. And we go back to the car, and he wedges it under the axle. You can't get it, it's like this. And then he goes, go in reverse and try to, and pop the car up onto the rock on the axle. Well, what are the odds of being able to do that, right? So I did it. We put the rock under there, and I got in the car and started to, and the rock's going down the road, and all of a sudden the car bounces up, and he goes, stop! And I slam on the brakes, and sure enough, we're like perfectly on top of the rock on the axle, and the tire's off the ground.
So you didn't need the jack after?
Well, let me finish the story. So we get the tire off. It's flat, so it comes off. But the new tire we couldn't quite get on because it raised it, but not enough for the tire with air in it. So we're out there chiseling the crummy asphalt. We get it so we can get the tire on. And we get the tire on, put everything back, and then we just start driving. And we're like all jumping for joy. The whole thing probably took an hour and a half. And we're driving, and there's no one out there. It's completely, you're complete desolation. And we're like, well, so what about that guy with the bike? And I go, if we see him, we'll pull him, we'll give him some money, And sure enough, after about 15 minutes of driving, here comes the guy. He's on his bike, and he's coming towards us. Like, well, there he is. So we pull over to the guy, and we look at him like this, and what does he have? He doesn't have a jack. He has the bicycle pump. So we're like, oh shit, we're lucky we gotta go. We'd be waiting, he'd show up with the bicycle pump, not a jack. So we gave him like $10, and he was all pissed off because he wanted 15. And we just bailed. So after that, Bill became known around the point as MacGyver, because the way he thought up the thing with the rock under the axle. It was pretty classic. We brought all our food in. You'd plan out like, oh, we'll have pasta this night and blah, blah, blah. And if you could catch fish, that was a bonus. And that water, I took all bottled water. There was a well near there that Pablo, he was, you know, pretty feral. He'd boil his water. He'd spend the whole day, his whole day was like a fire with sticks, you know, not even gas. He'd be like collecting dry brush, and he'd have a little pot boiling water. By the time the water was boiled and cool, he'd have drunk it. So he was constantly on a cycle of boiling water. It just seemed kind of too much for me, so I just bought bottled water. But then you got to get it all in there and carry it. So
Yeah, Pablo sounds like
Pablo's still there to this day, and he's still probably pretty feral. You'll meet him, I'm sure. The current of the channel of the Lombok Strait, because it's so deep, when it's low tide and it's draining and going out, which is what you want in the afternoon, when you kick out of the wave, it's like a conveyor belt that just goes back to the takeoff. But you have to know when to start coming in and hug the reef and get out of the current, or you'll just keep going. And so a lot of guys would come over on the boats, and they weren't hip to that, and then we'd be like hugging the reef, sitting there where the current's not there, but you might go 10 feet over and it's ripping. And those guys would get sucked out, and they literally could not paddle back to the takeoff. So we'd sit there kind of chuckling to ourselves, and they might be 50 feet away just paddling. And there's no way they can paddle against it. They'd have to try to go in and come back like that. And sometimes you'd be out there in the afternoons and it's super good, there's nobody there, and you see one of the boats coming. Like the Ann Judith was a boat that used to come from Bali with an Aussie guy, and he had surfers on it. And then they would anchor there. Later, years later, the Ann Judith went down at night, anchored, drifted, got washed in, got all smashed up and all ripped apart by the Indos. But anyway, we'd see the Ann Judith come around the tip of the island by the lighthouse. We go, oh shit, here they come. Meaning our little session of just us, 5 or 6 guys, is pretty soon there's gonna be 8 or 9 guys jumping off the Ann Judith, invading our lineup, you know. So we'd see the boat coming, and it just kept coming and coming and coming. And then we realized they're never gonna get here because the tide's just ripping out that channel, and they're trying to make it up the channel against the low tide and the current, and they would never make it. And of course they'd be there the next morning because they made it at some point in time, but that particular day or that night they couldn't make it. So the current is pretty gnarly. A good wave at deserts, the takeoffs, really there's one takeoff zone, although you can take off all the way down the line, obviously, but if you have your choice, you're gonna go to one spot if there's no people there. The takeoff's easy. You can get a little barrel right off your first turn, but it's nothing spectacular, but it's a little barrel, and then it starts running down the point, down the reef, where you just start macking out your speed, and then you just do a little speed check and start pulling into the tube, and you can go and get barreled, you know, countless times. And then the wave just keeps funneling down. We used to time guys when they'd take off to see how far it would get till they kick out, and some of them would be like 45 seconds of surfing, all high-speed surfing. And then the wave starts to get a little fat, and then it starts to get bigger. So the wave might be head high, and you get down to the tail end, and then all of a sudden it keeps peeling, but the wave grows, it gets bigger. They call it the grower. And I always would kick out. We have one friend named Chris that would always go into it. He's probably the first guy ever that kept going into the grower. Wave after wave, he'd always break boards, he'd be all cut up, because once you get into the wave, it's perfect. It's a big tube and it gets bigger, but you can't go fast enough to to get out of the wave. You're like, you're stuck in it, you're going, there's no exit. The only exit is you finally, you either eat it, or you try to quick through the wave, which is hard to get an edge because you're already in the tube. There's no straightening off, and it's pretty impressive. Now the grower, I heard, is a legitimate surf spot. There's like 70 guys at the normal spot, and there's 20 guys sitting on the grower, which is, I can't even imagine that's what they're doing. It's so crowded that they've resorted to surfing the grower, you know. But our one friend would always just get cut up, torn up, but we love watching him go into the grower. You know, he'd backside, he'd pump, and he'd just pig dog and just go in, and the wave would just funnel off. And it's really a sight to see. We used to go down on the inside and just watch the grower when it was like 10 feet, watch it just unloading. And I go, could you imagine if you could choose a form of death, that you decided to just go down into the grower and just take off on like a 10-foot, 12-foot wave, and just, that's the way you're gonna die. But, I was the resident doctor, because my friend, that guy Tony that I told you about with his girlfriend that was in the car with us that time with Bill, he's actually a male nurse in LA. So he gave me all lidocaine, syringes, all different kinds of stitching stuff, different size needles, everything, and he showed me how to tie knots. You know, we'd practice on a piece of cardboard here at home with a thing. Yeah, you go like this, he gave me the little, what are they called, the little snippy things. So anyway, if somebody got stitches, I'd stitch them up, which was, I actually looked forward to somebody getting cut up so I could stitch them up. But we'd only use it on our immediate little group of people. If a guy off a boat got cut, we're not going to waste our lidocaine and our stitches on a guy that we might need for us. So one time, we're sitting there in the peanut gallery just watching, you know, and we just saw this guy walking on the reef. He came in from the waves, and he just started walking super fast along the rocks with his hand like this, and I went, uh-oh, look at this dude, he's got something going on. So we walked down on the reef, and he comes up to us, and he moves his hand, and like right above his eye and his forehead, he's got like a rock. You could see like a, you know, like the tip of your thumb, he has a rock just like stuck in his forehead. And he's going, how is it? How is it? And I go, well, it's not good. You probably need to go get stitches somewhere, but we can't help you over here. And then my one friend, Nick, was right there, the Kiwi guy, and he reached up to the rock and went, and popped it out of his forehead, and he went, "Egal, mate, souvenir, Desert Point." And the guy just walked off. It was pretty classic. But yeah, if you got hurt, you know, I could stitch you up pretty good. I stitched up a bunch of guys, toes, feet, heads. You know, I actually have a video of me stitching up a guy. It's probably it's like a comedy, because he hit his head on the reef. Jono, the fisherman guy, hit his head on the reef surfing at too high a tide. Came in, had a bump on his head, and we looked at it. And he had long hair, so we shaved it, and now he just had like a bump. And I was getting all my stuff ready to do the stitches, getting the gloves, getting everything set up, and we went back to his head because we were filming it. The bump had gotten bigger. It was growing. It was going, whoa. And now he had a full giant like egg on his head with the slice. So I stitched it up, and it was funny because you could just watch the bump growing through the video, I think. You know. So I stitched him up, and he was back out that afternoon.
Right on, head wounds.
Yeah, head wounds, and plus with stitches you can close it, and he's good to go. Then there's the story of the guy Blair, I believe is his name, that got whacked with the machete when we all quit camping at the point, because there was a few too many guys, and some of the fishermen, I think from a village, the fishing village called Ampanon, realized there's a bunch of gringo surfers out here, we can go rob them. I think that's where they came from. But anyway, I wasn't there, but the story's something like everybody's sleeping at night in their tents, and they just woke up. There's a bunch of Indos there, probably like 6 or 10 of them, and they're rifling people out of their tents and trying to rob them. And they got a bunch of stuff from everybody, and then they retreated down the river mouth. There's like a riverbed, actually. They started going down the riverbed on foot, the robbers, probably to get out to cross over to Banco Bay, probably where they had their boats. That's what I'm thinking. And this guy Blair went chasing down the riverbed after a group of Indos with machetes. And apparently he ran up on them and said, hey, hey, and he had a stick, one guy and a bunch of them, and they just turned around and came back and whacked him with the machete, and his arm was supposedly pretty like hanging there, kind of like by a couple threads. And then he came back in to where everybody was, and then my friend Chris and Pablo and a couple guys, they had no cars, no nothing out there. They literally kind of held his arm and wrapped stuff around it and carried him all the way out to the road that's super far, and got him into Mataram and saved his arm and pretty much his life. He would have been dead. And that's the story about that. And then I guess he came back a few years later, had a big gnarly scar there. And anyway, after that episode, everybody quit camping. That was the end of camping on Desert Point for quite a few years. And then they used to rent houses, and we'd rent houses that are probably 10-minute motorcycle ride from the point. But now back out there, from what I understand, you'll see, is a bunch of bungalows, all kinds of stuff now, where people are staying. But that was the original thing that people got scared and pulled out. In 2002, and there was a group of, that's when I said, I'm done, I'm never coming back. They were having a boogie board contest on Sumbawa, and 4 boatloads came of spongers on boogie boards. Guys that are, I mean, the best boogie boarders, but still, they're boogie boarders. And there would be like, I was there trying to get a surf. I'm only there for like a short time. I already knew I was winding down. And here's 50, 60 boogie boarders out there on every freaking wave. And I just went out there, and nobody, even all the guys weren't even going to go out, but they're there all season. I'm only there for a few weeks, so I got to surf. So I went out there and just got into it with all the boogie boarders, and had one guy, a big guy, I had dropped in on him, you know, and was going down the line. He was behind me on his boogie board, pumping, trying to catch me, and you know. And then he got me back again and did the same thing to me. And anyway, the guy eventually wanted to fight and beat me up, and you know, he was a big guy, a big kid, you know, probably like 20 years old. And I remember I kicked out of a wave, and he was there, and I started trying to hit him with my board because he was kind of getting aggro. And I just remember him grabbing me, and he brought his fist back, and he had a big giant fist like that. And remember, he said, "Good night." That was the last thing I heard. Then he went, whoop! He went to punch me out, and I guess I moved, and he just skinned me. He didn't really knock me out or anything. And then I just beelined it for the beach and just went in, and that was it. That was the end of my deserts. Good night.